This is video 9E for the Year 7 Mathematics course. In this video, we're going to be covering the theory behind finding a percentage of a quantity under the topic of percentage. Specifically, we are going to explore why we find percentages of quantities, how to find a percentage of a quantity, a revision on converting percentages into decimals and fractions, and then we're going to cover some example questions. Another one of the most important and widely used applications of percentages is to actually find a certain percentage of a number or a certain quantity that we're working with. This is particularly useful, especially when it comes to things like money. So for example, we might want to find 10% of $70, or we might want to find something like 76% of $1,200, and so on. Point is that when we're dealing with percentages, one of the core reasons why we actually use percentages is to find a certain percentage of a certain quantity. And this is a very, very, very commonly used application of percentages. So this is what we're going to be focusing this video on. How do we find a certain percentage of a given quantity? Now, I would like to focus on this sentence of finding a percent of a quantity B. Now, we of course know that when we're talking about mathematics, this word of typically reflects the idea of a multiplication. So in other words, if we were to instead convert this sentence into a mathematical expression, this here would be a percent multiplied by the quantity B. So this is exactly how we find percentages of quantities. We get the percentage and then we multiply it by the quantity itself. Now, when we're going about this process, you've got one of two ways that you can go about doing it. We can either turn the percentage into a decimal or a fraction. It just depends on whether you'd prefer to work with fractional multiplication or decimal multiplication. However, when we're going through these types of examples, we will cover both methods in terms of turning the percentage into both a decimal and a fraction. And like I said, from there, it's more or less just a personal preference. Do you prefer to work with fractions in multiplication or decimals in multiplication? Now, in order to go through this process, you do need to have a good understanding of how we turn percentages into decimals and fractions. So we'll just give a quick reminder here. In order to turn a percentage into a decimal, we simply divide the percentage by 100. And if we want to turn a percentage into a fraction, all we need to do is write the percentage as the numerator of a fraction over 100. So just as a very, very quick example, let's say we had the percentage 75%. If we want to turn this into a decimal, we divide by 100. So in other words, we move the decimal place left 2 times. So this would then be 0.75. If we wanted to write it as a fraction, we write the fraction as 75 over 100, which we could then simplify to 3 over 4 if we wanted to. Once you've then made this conversion into either a fraction or a decimal, it's just a simple case of performing the multiplication and then answering the question from there. So let's now go through a few examples of how we can find a certain percentage of a quantity. Alright, so let's say first of all we wanted to find 20% of 500. So first thing that we're going to do here is convert this 20% into a decimal and or fraction. Like I was saying earlier, just to get some good exposure, let's just do both. So 20% as a decimal will be 0.2. As a fraction, it will be 20 over 100, or in other words, 1 over 5. So if we now want to find 20% of 500, we get this decimal, 0.2, and we can multiply it by 500. Or we can get this fraction, 1 over 5, and then we can multiply it by 500. Performing either of these will give you the exact same answer of 100. So in other words, 20% of 500 is 100. Second example to consider is to find 75% of 84 meters. So once again, first things first, let's turn the 75% into both a decimal and a fraction. 75% as a decimal by dividing by 100 is equivalent to 0.75, or as a fraction will be 75 over 100. If we were to then simplify this fraction, we would get 3 over 4. So if we now want to find out what 75% of 84 meters is, we'll first of all get this decimal of 0.75 and we'll multiply it by the 84. Or we could get the fraction, 3 over 4, and then multiply it by the 84. However, in either case, we get a final answer of 63 meters. Notice in this particular case, because we are actually finding the percentage of a quantity, in this case 84 meters, the answers both have meters in them as well. Alright, final example that we're going to consider is to find 3% of $1,500. Alright, so again, first thing that we'll do here is convert this percentage into a decimal and into a fraction. As a decimal, 3%, dividing this by 100, we get 0.03. As a fraction, we'll get 3 over 100. So now, if we want to find out 3% of $1,500, we can first of all get this decimal, 0.03, and multiply it by the 1,500. Or we can get this fraction, 3 over 100, and then multiply it by the 1,500. In either case, we get a final answer of $45. And once again, recall the fact that since we're actually finding the percentage of a certain quantity, in this case here $1,500, our final answers also have the units of dollars. Alrighty, let's summarize what we've learned today. So in this video, we delved into how to find a percentage of a quantity. To find a percentage of a quantity, we multiply the quantity value by the percentage. That is, to find A% of quantity B, we compute A% times B. To do this, we can convert the percentage into a decimal or a fraction, whichever one your preference is, and then perform the multiplication from there. As a reminder, to convert a percentage to a decimal, we divide by 100. And to convert a percentage to a fraction, we write as a fraction with denominator 100. We then applied this process to some example questions. And that's it for now. See you in the next video.